All right, so still on project planning, we continue off our discussion by transitioning into project scheduling, um, an extremely important part of project planning. Typically, this involves coming up with timelines and durations associated with the various activities and tasks aligned with your project. Even more important for you because a number of techniques that are going to be discussed in this subsection are expected to be integrated within your respective project proposal reports, right? So if I were you, I would really pay particular attention to this part of the project and this part of the lecture series. And in fact, most of these things you get to reuse when covering or when you enroll into 4014 next year. So great. All right, again, this whole notion of project scheduling is a systematic way or process that involves deciding what work activities are aligned or associated with your project and how exactly those work activities are organized into separate tasks. Even more important is specifics of when those tasks are going to be executed and how long each one of those individual tasks are supposed to take, right? A misconception that most people make is, at least at the beginning, project management or project scheduling is neglecting to remember that you can actually schedule tasks in parallel. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you, let's say, have identified a total of 20 tasks aligned with your project, then you should execute them one after the other. You can, in fact, interleave them and execute them in parallel if you wish. Okay, so project scheduling also involves this whole process of estimating the associated calendar time needed to complete each of the individual tasks, right? The relative effort associated with the task and specifics of which project team members are going to work on the tasks identified. Right? So essentially assigning tasks to roles and then tying roles to individual project team members. You obviously also have to estimate the resources that are associated with the different project activities, obviously. And remember, we said other than the individuals or human beings that are going to work on the project, you're looking at resources such as specialized hardware that you might want to use, things like case tools, for instance, and simulators, depending on the type of project that you are working on. We already highlighted that it's usually the case for these long-term projects that people might potentially want to travel for training, for instance, or maybe travel to attend a workshop, right? A funny story here, it's somewhat a common occurrence for a number of projects, at least in this part of the world, to involve people traveling to so-called retreats where they get to hold workshops. It does help though. People tend to pay more attention on the project as opposed to when they're in their normal habitat where they'll be busy doing other things, right? So it's just a side note here. Again, what you tend to do when you embark upon this project scheduling process really is just split up the tasks and estimate times and resources. And what you typically do is really organize the tasks concurrently so that the whole execution process is much more optimal, right? So you identify tasks that can be undertaken in parallel to reduce the amount of time, I guess, person days that are going to be associated to those particular tasks. And then one of the things that project managers will typically do is to reduce potential dependencies that may exist in between tasks. The thing here with dependencies is if a task has a dependency on another task, then what that means is that you cannot execute that task before the tasks that it is dependent on are completed, right? So if you want to avoid delays, you want to make sure that you reduce or you minimize the task dependencies. And of course, this whole process of reducing so-called task dependencies will typically be at the discretion of the project managers, and it will depend on what sort of experience that project manager or the project managers might have. In certain instances, educated guesses would have to be made, right? Intuition. Okay, so in terms of the end-to-end process involved with project scheduling, you go through a process where you first of all start by identifying activities associated with your project, right? So in the case of these group-based projects that we are working on, you identify key activities associated with your project. The obvious ones would be the ones associated with the SDLC, so the software development lifecycle, so requirements engineering, design, implementation, testing, perhaps deployment, right? There's potentially other tasks that are embedded. We know that, for instance, we're going to have to do project presentations. We're going to have to write proposals, right? So all those different activities and sub-activities will need to be identified. And then you identify dependencies that might potentially exist in between the different activities, right? And again, as you're identifying the dependencies, you try and isolate, or you try as much as possible to minimize the dependencies that might exist. And then after that, you thoroughly estimate, or you come up with an estimation of what sort of resources you're going to have to allocate to the different activities. In the case of the group-based projects, the most important resource here would be the people, the human beings that make up the project team, right? So how are you going to distribute those different people to the various tasks that you have identified? Once you do that, you allocate individual people to the activities, right? And of course, our estimation here perhaps would be like pointless because we have a limited resource pool by way of people here. It's either 4 or 5. There's nothing like you can go out there and hire other people to be part of a project, right? Won't fly in this course. So you allocate people to the activities, and then you create visual representations of the different artifacts associated with project scheduling. Yeah. Key things here is you want to make sure that all the project activities are included on the schedule. You want to make sure that you comprehensively identify the dependencies that exist and you highlight them, right? Come up with an estimation of the sort of resources you will need, right? A hint here, looking at this whole COVID-19 pandemic thing here, the other resource that you might want to take into account here is perhaps data bundles, right? Because for you to be able to meet virtually with your colleagues, you need to make sure that you have enough data bundles. So you have to come up with a strategy as a group on how you're going to handle those things. So you estimate the resources, but remember that this estimation process requires very careful attention. You want to be extremely careful. The reason why you want to be careful with estimation is the last thing you want to do is to go over budget, and more importantly for the group-based projects, to delay the project, right? And then finally, like I said, you come up with visual representation or visual representations for these project schedules. Now, there are different charts that are used out there, but the ones that we're going to focus more on in this course are the work breakdown structures, the Gantt charts, the activity networks, and so-called RACI metrics. Right? And we're going to go through these in sequence to try and gain an appreciation of how to actually prepare these graphs and charts. In terms of challenges associated with project scheduling, you want to take note of the following. The whole process of estimation is not an easy task, right? Remember we said project managers would typically use a combination of past experience and intuition or educated guesses, right? So that makes it really hard, but turns out that with time you become more experienced in scheduling projects, and so it's eventually become more intuitive. Another challenge or misconception that people have is assuming that productivity is proportional, right? So if you have 4 people working on a project doesn't necessarily mean that each of those 4 individuals will contribute an equal share of effort towards the project, right? So if you say have an activity that is expected to take 20 hours, it doesn't necessarily mean that each one of the 5 group members will contribute 4 hours towards that project. No, it doesn't work like that, right? Another scheduling challenge here is the temptation to add people to the project towards the end of the project or midway through the project, right? You might end up delaying the project because new people normally introduce things such as communication overheads, right? They would have to learn the way that people that are already working on the project interact with each other, for instance. So imagine this, right? For the group-based projects, if you identified a fellow colleague from class who doesn't have a group, and I know there are people that don't already have groups, can't for the life of me figure out why. If you were to introduce them to be part of the project, it would be really hard for them to integrate. Why? Because you've already figured out how best to work with each other as a group, right? You know how to communicate. You've already set up, hopefully you've already come up with a plan on how frequently you meet as a group, right? So if somebody new joins your group, they would have to adapt to the way that you do things. And that generally takes time. Another challenge is wrong things always happen, right? So you want to expect problems to occur during the course of the project, right? And always come up with workarounds by integrating those workarounds into your overall project plan. Okay, so remember we said once the last step is essentially to create these project charts. So the question is, how exactly do you come up with these presentations of the project schedule? Well, it turns out that you can use a combination of text notations, graphical notations, and sometimes even tables, right? It all depends on the type of technique that you're using. But essentially what these presentations will do is they'll highlight things like how the various tasks associated with the projects are broken down from the underlying activities. The other thing you want to take into account here with regards to the presentation is that there are certain techniques that are calendar based, right? So things like the Gantt chart, for instance. So you want to make sure that all those different presentations that involve calendar dates show the schedules aligned with the activities and the resources against the time. And then visual representations like activity network diagrams, for instance, will highlight task dependencies and things like the critical path associated with the project. So the longest sequence, or rather the path within the project timeline that is composed of tasks that should not be delayed. If any of the tasks that fall within the critical path are delayed, then that will result in the entire project being delayed. And then you also use activity networks to essentially compute things such as the slack, right, associated with the various activities. Okay, so I thought before we start looking, we're going to look at all these different techniques here we mentioned here, right, in sequence. But before we do that, I just thought I would quickly highlight some software tools that you're going to find very useful as you're coming up with these artifacts. Caveat here, this is by no means comprehensive. What I've done is listed tools that I've worked with personally, tools that I know are easy to access with the exception of one, right, Microsoft Project. All of these tools can be downloaded and used for free, right? So first up is, and I highly recommend that you probably start off with Project Libre, right? Very, very nice tool. I've been using it for way over a decade now, and it's actually evolved over time. It's marketed as being the open source alternative to Microsoft Project, right? So if you're interested in finding out more, and I do encourage you to do this, more about Project Libre, just go to this link. You should be able to find a downloads link somewhere there, so you can already download it and then install it and start playing around with it. A key thing to note about Project Libre here is that they make use of two different models. So the community edition is available for free, so you download it and then you install it on your local machine, your desktop or laptop. But the cloud-based version is still work in progress. If you're curious like me, you probably want to sign up so that once they start running their beta testing, then you get notification and you can already play around with this. So, but the cloud-based version would be something that's akin to Google Docs, for instance. So instead of installing a local instance of Project Libre, you'd access it in the cloud, similar to the way we access Google Docs or Google Sheets and Google Slides. If you're curious to learn more about how Project Libre looks like, right? Just go to Project Libre here. Very basic interface. This is sort of interface that you work with, and there's a number of nifty features. I'll probably just quickly load an existing sample project that I have here. Very basic user interface that allows you access to things like Gantt chart, right? So you can use it to create a Gantt chart. You can, let me just zoom out so that it's much clearer here. You can use this to create a work breakdown structure, right? And we'll discuss work breakdown structures just now. You can also use it to create an activity network, right? So very, very useful tool, excellent tool actually. I cannot recommend it more. In fact, if I was to choose between the different tools that I'm going to walk you through, I would highly recommend Project Libre. Okay. So another alternative would be Open Project, but unfortunately for Open Project, the installation process is not that easy. In an ideal case, this would need to be set up on a server platform, and then you have multiple people accessing that instance. We had initially come up with a plan to actually set up an instance on the list server, but that hasn't materialized, in part because the server hardware that we use, or the server that we use, has been giving us problems. We don't have enough resources there. Again, they make the people behind the software to have 3 different models. The community version is available for free. All you have to do is download it and then you install it on your own. The cloud-based version, of course, sadly requires that you pay a monthly subscription fee of about €4.95, but almost €5 here. And then the enterprise version here, which is slightly more expensive, would be more applicable to, I guess, software development firms out there. If you feel adventurous, I would highly encourage that you download the community edition and attempt to install it. The installation process shouldn't be that hard. It's just that you need prerequisite components, software components, for this to be able to work. It's web-based, so you need to install a web server, for instance. And I think this thing is implemented in, is it PHP? I wanted to check, but it's fine. I'm not sure what programming language is used to implement this, but so you need, if it's PHP, then you need a PHP interpreter, right? I'm curious here. Let me just quickly find out. Or rather, instead of programming language, oh, there we go. Oh, so it's written in Ruby and Rails, so you need a Rails application server for you to be able to do that, sadly. Wow, forgot. It's written in Ruby and Rails. Forget about Angular. Angular is just JavaScript framework. Okay. There we go. So you have to go through a painful process of installing Ruby gems. Good luck with that if you have plans of playing around with Open Project. But in the event that you want to gain a sense of how the interface looks like, I do have access to an Open Project instance at my alma mater. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to log in here, right? So that people have a sense of how the interface looks like. So very simple interface, like landing page here. You log in, and once you sign in, you are presented with this sort of interface. So using this interface, I have access to projects that I would have been a part of, right? And to give you an idea of a sample project here, I guess I'll just go to my personal PhD project to see if I can scroll through different components. So you notice that I have access to things like work packages associated with this project, right? And hopefully I should be able to see a list of the different work packages, yeah? I can also navigate to a timeline, yeah? There we go. So this is a multi-year timeline. I think this project spanned, not I think actually, it spanned a little over 5, maybe 6 years. So it was undertaken between 2013 all the way up to 2018, right? All right, so hopefully that gives you an idea of how or what sort of interface is associated with Open Project. Very useful tool. In the past, I didn't include this, but I also played Open Goo. Was that Open Goo project? Right. Open. I think I played. At my alma mater we used. Is it Open Goo? It should be Open Goo as well. It should be Open Goo. I think. I've forgotten the name of the software, but it should be Open Goo. They've rebranded to Fang, I guess. Yeah, yet another okay tool, I guess. If you, I didn't know they changed names. If you are feeling adventurous, I would encourage you to look into, I guess they're calling themselves Fang now, but they used to be called Open Goo, right? Open Goo here. Very useful project management tool as well. Okay, so besides Open Project and Fang, I guess, something else I'd recommend you look into is Lucid Charts. And the reason I'm recommending Lucid Charts is because it's a cloud-based platform. And you wouldn't, if you actually do decide to use Lucid Charts, you'd be able to use it to develop the other artifacts that we're going to discuss once we look at the unified modeling language at a later stage, right? So it has an option for you to actually produce artifacts such as use case diagrams, for instance, and class diagrams and activity charts, right? But the thing that I wanted to draw attention to is that using our educational accounts, aka our user assigned email accounts, you actually have access to what they call the free tier, right? In case you're interested in how the interface looks like, I will quickly navigate to Lucid Charts if I can find it, which is here. So this is the interface, and you notice that let me see if I can go to the homepage of the dashboard. This is my dashboard here, but if I go under templates, right? I don't know if you can see this, but if I go under templates, I have access to different types of diagrams that I could create, and among them are I guess diagrams associated with timeline, with planning, right? So I can create timelines, right? Gantt charts. I think there should be a provision to create work breakdown structures here as well. But I cannot recommend Lucid Charts enough, just like I am recommending Project Libre, right? I do encourage you to go to lucidcharts.com using your own assigned email accounts, and you can already start playing around with this platform. Very useful. The other cool thing I like about Lucid Charts is that there is a let me just go to there's actually a plugin for Google Docs, right? So you can easily pull diagrams that you'd have created using Lucid Charts, from within Google Docs, right? Think about this for a second. Once you start writing your proposals, you are collaborating with your colleagues. One of the tools that you're going to use is perhaps Google Docs, right? So integrating these charts is as easy as just installing. Oh my God! I thought I had. Maybe I don't. Maybe the add-on is here. Actually, if I go to Google Slides, yeah, there you go. In Google Slides, so for instance, if I wanted to integrate, I'll go right at the end, and let me see if I can add a new slide here. So if I wanted to add a chart from Lucid Charts, right? A chart using Lucid Charts, all I'd have to do is install the add-on called Lucid Charts Diagrams, and then using this add-on, I get to insert different diagrams here. It's as easy as that. And all I have to do is use this panel on my right to pick the appropriate diagram. It's taking a bit of time because it's making use of the Lucid Chart API, essentially. So what I would be putting here is diagrams that I would have created using Lucid Charts. Observe, if I said I want to create an example, wow. Let's say Gantt chart, and then this is going to be an example here. If I want to create a Gantt chart, I want to integrate it within Google Slides. Wondering why this is. Okay, so it's because the free tier account is limited to 3 documents, and I probably have more than 3 documents. I wonder if. Anyway, but the bottom line is using using this plugin, you can easily pull diagrams from Lucid Charts and integrate them into Google Slides or Google Docs, right? So it's as easy as that. Very useful feature. If I were you, I would really seriously look into this, right? It makes life a lot easier, and then you have access to your diagram like so. All right, so besides Lucid Charts, the final recommendation, it's not really a recommendation, really. I wouldn't recommend this thing to anyone, right? The reason I wouldn't recommend this is because you need money to gain access to the platform itself. But perhaps one of the reasons you might want to invest time learning how to use Microsoft Project is because a number of organizations out there would tend to use Microsoft Project for project management. Right, so if you ever land yourself a job and you are required to do any sort of project management task, it's highly likely that one of the case tools you're going to be using that organization is Microsoft Project. But I wouldn't recommend this thing. I mean, if you go to, I hope I have Microsoft Project. I mean, would you really be willing to pay $10 per month just so you can use Microsoft Project? Would you? It's a question I'm asking, right? I don't think so. And I'll answer on your behalf because obviously you're not around to respond, but I don't think so. Why? What this means is that you need, in case people are wondering here, the current exchange rate is at, let me just quickly check my app here. But the current exchange rate is, so $1 is equal to 18 kwacha 68 ingwe. So what you would need is for you to be able to use Microsoft Project in the cloud, you need to pay 186 kwacha every month. Right? So good luck with that anyway. Okay. Hopefully that that rundown of the different case tools is helpful, right? So I just thought before we start looking at these different presentations or charts, I just thought we'd do a recap on how we get to break up a project, because it turns out that these different components, the constituent components of the project, are the ones that you use as input to produce the presentation. So artifacts such as or charts such as the Gantt chart, the work breakdown structure, and the activity network, right? So a reminder here that you typically break up a project into activities, and the activities are subsequently broken down into tasks. Tasks and activities are associated with the duration and calendar dates, right? Start times, end times, duration. And it's usually the case that you'd break down these activities, insofar as the schedule is concerned, down to, let's say, a unit of time such as a week. A week is usually good, right? In certain instances, you might want to break them up based on, let's say, bi-weekly units. Okay, the other thing you need to remember here is that you typically need to associate effort to these different activities, right? And the effort is normally represented in the person days or the duration associated with that work package or the work unit. So how many person days are going to be needed to accomplish the task? You also specify things like deadlines, right, associated with different activities. And you define really the endpoints, right? And these endpoints we're referring to here, endpoints are activities that typically conducted on a single date or period of time. So things like, these would be milestones, by the way, things like regular scheduled meetings, right? It's a milestone because it marks an end point of an activity. Okay, again, there's usually this, still talking about milestones, there's usually this misconception about how different a milestone is to a deliverable. A milestone just makes a point in time. It marks an end point of an activity. So things like regular meetings and handovers being conducted, handovers for the system, right? A deliverable, on the other hand, is an actual product associated with the project. So documentation, code associated with the software, the actual executables associated with the software that you're developing. And so typically, at a bare minimum, as input to these different charts that we are going to look at, you typically want to come up with information that's presented in this manner, right? So each task must have an ID that uniquely identifies it. You obviously need a name associated with the task. You need to indicate the relative effort, right? Although this is optional, but duration is important, obviously. So relative effort would be man hours or person days associated with that task, the duration, and whatever dependencies might exist, right? Or dependencies associated with that particular task. So for instance, task number 3 is dependent on task number 1. Ignore the M's here. These are just milestones, right? So what we're saying here is that milestone 1 is associated with task number 1. Okay, so I thought we'd pause here and then we're just going to briefly walk through the different artifacts.